Welcome to our webinar on the implications of the EU HTA process for manufacturers. We are still waiting for a few more people to join, so we'll just give it another minute or two because I can see a number of different people are just coming into the session. We really want to make this an interactive session, so throughout this session we will be asking different polls online. If you've got any questions or reactions, please put them in the Q&A chat or in the chat function, and we'll make sure that we address them as we go through. So I can see a lot of people are just coming online, so we'll give it one more minute and then we will make a start. Hopefully you can all see the slides that are on the screen as well. So while we're waiting for a few more people, what I would suggest is let's make a brief start in terms of introductions. So from my side, my name's Paul Craddy. I'm one of the managing partners of Remap Consulting. My background has been in pricing market access for my entire career, and over the last couple of years, I've been very closely monitoring and watching the EU HTA process in a lot of detail, and we're very interested to share the findings and insights today. On the call, we've also got Graham Foxon, the other managing partner. Graham, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Graham Foxon. Like Paul, I've got over 20 years of pricing market access experience, and I've been closely monitoring the EU HTA process right from when the first rumbling started about having such a process all the way through, and continuing to closely monitor what is going to happen in the near future.
Lovely, thank you. So I can see we've got a great number of people that have already joined. Welcome to those who've just signed in. And we're really delighted that you can join us today. And what we're going to do now is we're going to make a start and actually start to walk through. Graham?
We've just lost your presentation, Paul.
Have you?
Back again. Okay.
Right. So if we now move on to the subject of today's topic, but before that, a brief introduction about Remap Consulting, because we're aware that not everybody else you may know about us. So Remap Consulting is a specialist pricing market access consultancy. We focus on three main areas, which is launch, implementation, training, and pricing. We work with people like yourselves who are typically asking themselves questions around what's the optimal price for our product? Do we have the right evidence to support price and market access at launch? Do we have the right capabilities to help train our teams on pricing and market access? And finally, what is the right price or market access potential for any business development opportunities, usually as part of due diligence processes? Those are sort of the questions people come to us with. The focus of today's webinar is really going to be around the EU HTA and this new process that's coming into place. So we're going to aim to cover three key areas, which is what is the EU HTA process and why is it important? And go into specific detail around what's the new joint clinical assessment process and what is the joint scientific consultation. And we'll also follow this up towards the end of the session with a survey and the results of a survey we've done of about 30 pharma companies to understand their preparedness for the EU HTA process. So that's the agenda, and we're now going to dive straight into our first topic. But I would also add a slight caveat here that this is really a very rapidly evolving area, and a lot is changing almost on a daily basis at the moment. So what we're giving you today is our best understanding of the current situation, but it's still fluid and still evolving. As I said, we really want to make this interactive, and so we're going to ask for your input now. And we've got a polling question that's going to come up in a few seconds. And what we'd like to ask you is to rate your current knowledge on the EU HTA process. Do you have no knowledge, as in you've never heard the process? Limited knowledge, you kind of know the process, but not clear on the details. Good knowledge, you've got understanding of some of the details in the process. or an excellent knowledge. For example, you've been heavily involved in the discussions or been involved in the past UNETA discussions. So the poll is going to launch now. If you could provide your inputs, that would be fantastic. So everybody should have that in front of them. If you could rate your answers, hopefully we will see that shortly. So as the results are still coming in, we can see that about 9% of people say they have limited knowledge, no knowledge rather, 70% saying sort of limited knowledge, 20% good knowledge, and about 5% say excellent knowledge. So it's going to be really interesting to get your thoughts and feedback at the end of this session. Fantastic. So I'm going to finish the poll now, and we're going to continue to move on. So to start with, what is the EU HTA and why is it important? So the EU HTA process is something that has been put into place within the last 18 months to 2 years, but it's really taken place within the last 12 months. And what it is it's going to be an evidence-based process that will allow the EU bodies and the member states to determine the effectiveness of new and or existing health technologies. So it's going to be a body that sits above the countries that will actually help to assess different technologies that are coming to market. It's going to be made of two key parts. The first key part is called the Joint Clinical Assessment, or JCA. This is going to be an assessment of the new molecules that comes to the market, and it's going to look at assessing the clinical evidence for those products and providing that recommendation to the countries or the member states, which can actually use them for their own pricing reimbursement discussions. So that's for new products once they've been approved by the EMA. The second part of this process is called the Joint Scientific Consultation. This is basically early dialogue or scientific advice that happens before the phase 3 trial, so during clinical development. And it really is aiming to provide non-binding advice and guidance to company on how best to develop their clinical trials so that they can meet the requirements of the joint clinical assessment when they come to launch their product following the EMA. So those are the two key parts, and we're going to talk around those a lot more a bit later on. Now, the reason the EU has been pushing for this is because it hopes to achieve three key objectives. First is to speed up access to new and innovative therapies coming to the market. The second is to reduce duplication of work, because it realizes at the moment there is 27 different countries and a lot of them are doing their own HTA assessments. And so if they can reduce some of that burden into one central assessment, it should reduce resources and duplication. And finally, improve the harmonization of methodologies that are used for assessing clinical evaluations, because again, there's a significant diversity across the EU at the moment. And so trying to come up with a standard set of methods that can be applied across all countries. So those are the aims. We'll talk a bit more around whether we think they're going to be likely at the end. Now, it's really important to set out what this is and what it's not. So in terms of the joint clinical assessment process in the EU HTA itself, it's looking to assess the clinical aspects of the HTA process. So the JCA is solely going to be focused on the relative effectiveness and relative safety. It's not going to pass any guidance on price or access. That all will still sit at the country or member state level. But also, the JCA is not going to provide any value judgment. So it's not going to say which of the comparators is the right comparator or the right endpoint and how much the endpoint is, and is that clinically significant. It will merely state what the data is. So the JCA is really going to be a factual scientific process which will set out the data and the documents in the final report, rather than saying that product X is better than comparator Y, for example. The countries will really have their own responsibility in terms of the level of determining what the level of added benefit from clinical perspective, and still the access and pricing will still be done on the country level. And what's also going to be interesting is this: there's probably going to be two processes. There's going to be the new EU HTA process for products coming in, but for existing products that are on the market now, the current processes are likely to continue in parallel. So there's almost going to be a divergence of two products going through, two different assessments going through from a pricing and access perspective. So, to put simply, in the current situation for pricing market access across Europe, you've got two levels. You've got the European level and the country level. And if we think that most HTA assessments can be broken into sort of three core components, which is a clinical assessment, an economic assessment, and a price negotiation or price assessment. Currently, they all sit very clearly with at the country level. Now, if we were to wave a magic wand and come up with an ideal process, what that could look like, for example, in order to sort of minimize delays and to maximize efficiencies, the bulk of the work could be done at the European level. So the clinical assessment and potentially an economic assessment could be done at the European level, and then that provided to the countries to actually undertake their price negotiation. Now, that's one option, and obviously there's many different options that could happen, but that's not currently where we are today. Where we are today is that a joint clinical assessment will be done at the European level, but the countries will still have the ability to do a bit more clinical analysis at their local level if the comparator is wrong, or if there's different subpopulations which aren't represented in the EU assessment. Economic analysis and price is still very much a country level activity. As I mentioned at the start, there are still significant unknowns. So what we do know at the moment is that the EU HTA process is going ahead and will definitely be implemented. We've got some draft details from the UNETA work stream around the types of materials that will be developed and the details of those materials which have been shared and been out for consultation, and which we will touch on a bit later. And we've also got guidance in terms of the timelines for what this is looking like. Again, these are draft without being fully set in stone. Areas where there's significant uncertainty is around how the individual country P&R systems are actually going to interact with this new process and what that means for them. That's something that's probably going to play out over the next couple of years. Again, level of duplication that's going to happen at the country level and any additional evidence requirements as well are also still big unknowns. As well as what we're talking around today is the theory behind it. How is this actually going to look like when it's practically implemented? Because the process and the theory looks good, but there's going to be other issues or challenges that are going to be encountered when the practice actually gets rolled out into place. So let's dive into the joint clinical assessment in a bit more detail then. The first thing to note is timelines. So the go live date for this new process is 1st of January 2025. Now, there are a couple of caveats to this. That on the 1st of January 2025, it will only be for oncology products, AMTPs and medical devices. That's going to be the first wave of products. The next wave of products are those with orphan designation starting 1st of January 2028. And from 2030 onwards, it's going to be all centrally authorized EMA products moving forward. But this 1st of January 2025 date is important for new molecules, because the molecule itself will have to go to EMA on the 1st of January 2025 to be part of this new process. If you launch your molecule or submit to EMA on 2024 in December, you will not go through the new process. Likewise, any existing molecules which are indication expansion will not go through the new joint process as well. So this is only for the first indication for new molecules from 2025 that are oncology rather, AMTPs or medical devices. And what this means in terms of process, because there's a sort of bit of confusion from some people around what are the different bodies in this process actually going to be responsible for. So EMA is really a core part of this process, and the EMA is going to be still assessing the clinical efficacy and safety of the product. The new EU HTA, the JCA, is going to be focused on the relative safety and the relative effectiveness of the product, whereas the countries are going to be still responsible for determining the value judgments, so the additional clinical benefit and the price and or reimbursement status of the products. So in terms of the governance of this process, there is currently a coordination group that has been established, made up of different health technology assessment agencies from the different member states. And this is the coordination group that's going to oversee this whole process. And for a JCA, what it will do is they will appoint an assessor and a co-assessor to manage and run the process. So similar parallels to the EMA process. And they'll be from 2 different EU states. The responsibility of the assessor and the co-assessor will be to conduct the clinical assessment, prepare the draft report, and consult with any key stakeholders or important groups that need to be involved in this process. Once the process and the report is produced, they will then share that with the coordination group, which will approve the report. And once that's been approved by there, it will be published by the European Commission. In terms of the overall process for the JCA, it's going to be, there's 4 parts to it. The first is a scoping and PICO development exercise. The second is dossier development, which will be done obviously by the manufacturer. Then you've got dossier assessment, which will be undertaken by the assessor and co-assessor. And then you've got the final report that's published and outcomes that will be shared. So that's a top line summary of the process. I'm going to talk around these steps in a little more detail. The first step is around scoping and how is this assessment going to be structured. Now, what has been decided is that the PICO, which is Population Intervention Comparator Outcome, the PICO framework is going to be used to try and provide the structure to address the questions around relative effectiveness and safety. So what's going to happen is a survey is going to be developed, shared with the countries, and then the PICO is going to be brought back together, streamlined into as few as possible, and then that is what is the framework that's going to be used for the development of the dossier. So looking in this a bit more detail, the way the PICO is going to be collected is that the assessor and co-assessor will send out a survey to each of the 27 EU countries, and they will ask what are the PICOs within that country. So what's the population, intervention, comparator and outcome for every one of those 27 countries across the EU. Each of these will then be returned back to the co-assessor. Now, it's not clear what will happen if a country doesn't return a survey, but that's something that will be determined. Next, with the 27 surveys back, it will then be a process of trying to amalgamate and streamline the PICOs across, let's say, 27 worst case. Hopefully, there'll be a lot of similarities. And they will be consolidated into different parts. So with the aim of that, you'll end up with 1, 2, or 3 PICOs at the end of the process. So it's been very clear from the EU HTA team and from all those involved in the member state and the coordination group that we are not going to be in a situation where we're going to have 27 different PICOs that a manufacturer must compare to. it really is ideally going to be 1 or maybe 2 or 3 worst case, not 25 or 27. How this remains to be seen in practice will be the real crux or challenge of this process. Also, what's interesting to note is, unfortunately, the results of the PICO of what country has sent what won't be shared with manufacturers. So only the assessor and the co-assessor and the coordination group will know what the PICOs are, rather than the manufacturer. Had the manufacturers known what the PICO is, this would have actually helped to address the evidence gaps in the country level, which we'll come to a bit later. In terms of the outcomes of the report, so in terms of what's going to be published, again, this is going to be a factual report. So what is going to be published are all of the different outcomes. So if it's, let's say, an oncology product and progression-free survival, overall survival, time to remission, for example, are all relevant outcomes. They will all be listed in the discussion in the results section with the numbers that are associated with them. There will be no rating in terms of which are the most important outcomes or any value judgments around whether that is meaningful or not. So it's purely going to be a publication of data rather than a value assessment. The value assessment part will be very much down to the country level. And throughout this process, a number of stakeholder groups have been involved, including patient advocates as well. And so they're really trying to capture those endpoints that are both patient relevant as well as clinically meaningful, and also performance driven as well, hard endpoints, to really make sure that all endpoints for the relevant disease will be captured, but are also reliable, valid, and easy to use in practice. So the outcome from the JCA report dossier is that you'll just get a list of these endpoints and their measurements, which will then be used by the countries. The other key challenge here is around timing. So what we've got on this slide is, at the top, we've got the current EMA process. In the middle, in the sort of greeny colour, is the current process for pricing and reimbursement, which typically starts after marketing authorization is granted at around day 177. Now, what has been publicised so far is that the JCA report will be published 30 days after marketing authorization has been granted by the EMA. So typically, if we use these timelines from the EMA, we'd be looking at day 307 for when that would be published. The other time point that's been made is the submission date, and this will be 45 days before CHMP opinion. So again, the whole process is moving earlier in the clinical development timeline. So what this could mean, and again, this is where there's still uncertainty, is your manufacturer must submit the joint clinical assessment dossier on about day 170 of the EMA process, so 45 days before CHMP opinion. Now, there are some challenges with this in that the day 180, the indication is not necessarily finalised until day 180, and there could still be questions around that. So how that will be handled and worked through is an open question at the moment. So if we even work further back from that, what has been communicated is that there will be a scoping document and a scoping workshop that will actually take place around day 100 and day 130 of this process. And what will happen, which is once you submit to the EMA on day 1, you'll also get a letter of intent from the EU HTA process that you are going to enter into this process. And at the day 1 from the EU HTA timelines, that's when the assessor and co-assessor will start their work and start to develop the PICO survey and send that out around day 100, and day 130 is when they'll get the scoping workshop that they'll have to amalgamate and consolidate those PICOs. That is going to be shared ready for the dossier submission on day 170. So as you can see, this is really pushing the timelines backwards in terms of clinical development for market access, that when you come to submit for EMA approval, for regulatory approval, it's also going to be the same time as you're going to really need to be prepared for starting your EMA, your EU HTA dossier, your JCA dossier, because that's going to be 170 days later down the pathway. So it's really going to put additional pressures on manufacturers to get the resources and processes in place so that they can do this in a timely manner. One of the questions that keeps coming up is, how binding is this? What does this actually mean for the countries themselves? Because obviously the EU is a very diverse group of countries with different current processes and methods. So what has been stated is that countries can do their own complementary analysis beyond what has been done within the JCA. But what they're not allowed to do is ask for the same data again that has already been submitted. They can only do additional analysis if different methodologies or different patient populations or comparators which are not included in the report. The other point to note is that the EU is actually going to be monitoring and looking, and countries have to report back in terms of what parts of the JCA they've actually used in their P&R decision-making process, which parts have they used, how have they used them, and what have they done, and they have to feed this back to the European Commission. So the European Commission really gets a view in terms of what is being used and how it's being used by the countries. So this is definitely not, while it's non-binding, it really is being monitored closely in terms of what it's going to be used, but how that looks in the process, again, is one of those things that countries are currently trying to establish and work out. And what this may mean is that you've obviously got your EMA dossier that we submitted, you've got your new EU joint JCA dossier that's going to be submitted, and then when it comes to the country level, you may have still different country dossiers that will need to be developed. And this could be that there are evidence gaps that are different, as I said, in terms of PICOs or populations that will need to be done, or it could be that they're more streamlined and focused more around the economic or pricing aspects as well. But at the moment, the countries are just starting to think about how these processes look like, because until recently they've had very little guidance from the EU and the EU UNETA around what these materials they're going to come out with. And so that's what they need to work with over the next 2 years, so that when the processes come into play from 1st of January 2025, they will actually be able to be up and running. Although it's worth noting, actually, realistically, the first JCA that we're going to see in practice, given that it takes 170 days, is probably going to be Q3 2025. So that's the first time we'll get sight of what a JCA will look like. And I think a lot of people will be very interested to see it when it comes out. And so, hypothetically, what might this mean in practice? Well, if you cluster the EU into, or EU markets into sort of 3 levels of sophistication, you've got those markets which are currently where prices or access is negotiated basically with limited HTA processes. And for those countries, having a joint EU HTA process like the JCA could be really beneficial, because it means that they could hopefully jump to the price and access negotiations much quicker. So for them, it could speed up access. And that could typically be some of the Eastern European countries, for example, which would welcome this process. You've then got those countries in the middle, for example, and these are purely illustrative at the moment based on our thoughts, which are more sort of middle-sized, which may want some additional economic or pricing analysis done to actually support the analysis in addition to what the JCA brings. And then finally, you can have the other basket of countries with much more sophisticated HTA process, like Germany, like Spain, like France, which could require additional clinical analysis as well as economic analysis, and then price negotiations as well. And so in these countries, you could end up actually slowing down access rather than necessarily speeding it up. But again, the aim here is to speed up the process, not slow it down. But whether that translates into practice on the ground, we'll have to wait and see. So that's a brief overview of the joint JCA, the Joint Clinical Assessment. I'm now going to hand over to Graham, who's going to talk around the Joint Scientific Consultation.
Thanks, Paul. So as well as doing the providing the JCA, as Paul mentioned, what they have also agreed to is that they're going to start offering joint scientific consultation, and they've already started doing this as a pilot ongoing at the moment. The aim of the joint scientific consultation is really to provide scientific advice before you start your pivotal phase 3 trials to help improve the quality of those studies so that they are not only relevant for EMA approval, but they're also relevant for the joint HTA. Yeah. So these scientific consultations, they are designed for any of you that were involved in the UNETA joint scientific advice process. It's going to follow a very similar structure. So it aims to provide non-binding scientific advice before you start your clinical studies. And the idea is to improve the quality and the appropriateness of the data produced by manufacturers from an EU HTA perspective. So what manufacturers can do is you can submit a list of questions and your justifications to the coordination group related to things like the trial design, the comparator, the endpoints, the health outcomes, the patient populations. And when you're submitting for this consultation, you can either seek advice only from the HTA bodies, so you can get advice back from the different HTA bodies across the EU, or you can also do it in combination with the EMA. So it's up to you as to where you would like to seek that advice from. Can you move to the next slide, Paul? I don't seem to have control. So for those companies that are currently developing their oncology, ATMPs or orphan drugs, you're probably already thinking about your phase 3 trial designs, and it's at this time that you may want to think approaching for this joint scientific advice. As I mentioned, they are doing a pilot trial at the moment, and they are selecting which companies and which products to seek guidance on. And it's hoped that in the future that they will broaden out this pilot to allow many more companies to seek scientific advice. So, to begin with, not all products will be eligible for this joint scientific consultation. They are going to be prioritizing specific molecules or based on a number of criteria. And the current criteria they're using are those conditions with the highest unmet need, where your product is going to be a first in class, where you are going to have a significant impact on patients' public health or healthcare systems. There may be a cross-border dimension. The value that you're adding is going to benefit countries in multiple European countries, and it is sort of high on the list of clinical research priorities. And through that, it normally would mean that it's going to be for a life-threatening or certainly a chronically debilitating condition. And it must also have a breakthrough sort of type of technology. So the evidence to date is suggesting that this is going to offer a substantial improvement in efficacy. So upon receiving your request for a joint scientific consultation, it will go through a preliminary assessment to see whether your product is selected for this scientific advice process.
what's interesting is the UNETA put out a call earlier in August, September for products using that same criteria, and they had a total of 10 products come in for 8 slots, so they were not overrun with it, which they thought that they might be. And the other key issue to raise with the scientific consultation is that there is now going to be a bit of a gap between the end of 2022 and the start of the JSC in 2025. So in 2023 and 2024, currently there is nothing scheduled and no scientific advice going on. So there is this sort of hole which products are going to fall into until the process starts in earnest from the 1st of January 2025. And so how that's going to be bridged, the European Commission and UNETA do realise that this is a challenge, and how that's going to be bridged, or if it's going to be bridged, is still something that is ongoing at the moment.
Can you move me forward? So what we have done just recently is we sent out a survey to a number of companies to get their perspective on what they think is, on how they think the EU HTA is going to impact their business, and also to get an understanding of how prepared they are for the upcoming EU HTA. So we've got a question for you. Considering the companies that you are currently working for, how prepared do you think your company is for this new EU HTA process? Do you think it's not prepared? Have you started having some internal discussions about the implications of it? Have you started to implement changes to meet the needs of the EU HTA at the sort of global level? Or have you actually started implementing across the entire organisation, including your local company or affiliate? So the survey should pop up now. I'll be very intrigued to see how well your companies have started considering the EU HTA process. So what I can see is it looks like the vast majority of you, 60% of you, have started some sort of internal discussion. About a third of you have not started having any discussions, and 5% of you have started to implement some changes at the global sort of level. But it's clear from seeing this that the vast majority of you have just started to discuss this, or perhaps not even started considering the implications of this within your organisation. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that your results very closely reflect that from our survey. Can we move forward, Paul? So from our survey, it's actually very, very similar. 48% of the people that we had interviewed had not started any sort of internal discussions because they felt that there wasn't enough information out there at this stage, or they didn't have the time to commit resources to thinking about something that's going to be happening, in 2025 and beyond. About 40% of the respondents had started raising awareness within the company and started trying to identify what changes needed to be made, or had introduced some sort of cross-functional working groups to determine what the implications of that would be. And a small minority of companies had started to actually make major changes and really consider the implementations of this, including being involved in sort of policy work around the EU HTA process. So when we came to look to see the companies in their the products the companies had in their pipeline, a lot of them that responded had either oncology or ATMP medical devices or orphan drug products. So we're going to be impacted relatively early on in the life cycle of this EU HTA, with about half of them having impacted at a later date of 2030. When we ask the companies, do you think this process will add benefits to you, or will it be more of a sort of hindrance or fourth hurdle? It was a bit split, actually. It was about a 50-50 split, with half of them thinking that the timelines are incredibly demanding from this process, and they felt that it would almost be like an additional hurdle, that it will increase the burden for companies. However, there were a number of companies that thought the fact that you only had to submit one dossier would lead to some benefits. I'm not sure whether these companies actually appreciated the fact that you still have to submit at the individual member state level, as well as submitting at the European level. And there was also about 30% of the companies we interviewed thought that there might be a shorter time to market. You might be able to get patient access in a shorter period of time. So when we dug a little bit deeper into this, it was apparent that those companies that had been involved in the EUnetHTA scientific advice process had a slightly more negative view of the process than those companies that hadn't previously engaged with EUnetHTA. So, it was clear that whilst 44% of total respondents thought that this would have somewhat negative impact, and only a third of them thought that it would be a positive impact, when you look at those companies that were involved had previously been involved in EUnetHTA, it was about 66% of those companies felt that it was going to have a negative impact, and only 30% thought it would be positive. So an interesting difference there between people's views of the EU HTA based on their historic interactions with EUnetHTA. So I'll just hand back to Paul now, who will provide you a summary of our discussions today.
Thank you, Graham. So one of the key questions up front was from the EU was that the aim is to speed up access to work, reduce duplication, and harmonise the methodologies. And on this slide, it presents our sort of thoughts around what this means. Speed up access to new therapies, potentially yes, in the longer term, because what is happening now is the whole process is being moved forward 6 to 9 months alongside the EMA process. So hopefully that should reduce some of the access times that are coming out from it. The reality is, though, this is probably not a short-term win, because it's going to take time for this process to bed in and for the bumps and kinks in the process to actually be ironed out. So looking to the future from sort of early mid-2030s, conceptually, it should help speed up access to therapies in the longer run. In terms of reduced duplication to work, the second point, it's uncertain or unlikely at the moment. If all countries use the JCA effectively and use them to help make value assessments, and then they can spend more time on the economic and/or price discussions and access discussions, yes, it should help reduce burden. But what we've seen from other countries with very sophisticated HTA process is that there's probably additional clinical analysis that they'll want to do, and so that could really hinder or slow down access as well in that time frame. In terms of the final point here around harmonising methodologies, it has been stated that they're trying to harmonise and align on methodologies. And from what I've heard from some of the discussions with UNETA, it's still a tough process, and it's still quite hard to come to agreement on, for example, the use of indirect treatment comparisons and the methodologies behind them. But what we'll hopefully see is that as this process continues to roll out and be implemented, there will be continued harmonisation on the approach and methods that are going to be used, and that are going to be used then by the local member states or the countries at the end as well. So depends if you look at this from a half glass full or half glass empty perspective. Positively, yes, these should be achieved. Negatively, it's going to take some time for them to get there, potentially. So to summarise what we've been talking around today, there's basically two key processes. There's the joint clinical assessment, which is a non-binding clinical assessment that is going to assess products at the European level and is then going to be used by each country's pricing and reimbursement decision-making process to make judgments around the price and the access of the products. Some countries will be able to make additional clinical assessments on top of it, and as I mentioned, price and economic analysis remains at the country level. There is the joint scientific consultation process that's going to be run alongside this, the JSC rather, and this is going to be really crucial from manufacturers to ensure that their comparators, their trials and their evidence base are structured in the right way to maximise the opportunity for the joint clinical assessment process that will come down the line. And this was stressed. I was at a meeting with some people from UNETA yesterday, and that was one of the key points they were stressing, which is we really want manufacturers to engage early and get in there. We want the discussion and have the discussion. But what this fundamentally means for all manufacturers is that market access is going to be pushed even further into the clinical development, even earlier in the clinical development pathway. And that means that the evidence bases and the activities that you're currently doing will probably have to go back 6 to 9 months within the process. Now, this is going to pose additional challenges in terms of phase 3 readouts, etc., but it's going to be really critical to make sure that they are cemented so that you can have the right evidence available, because there's going to be a relatively limited time between getting the evidence, developing the dossier from the PICOs that you've been provided to and you don't really get a say over, to when you actually have to submit the dossier to the assessors. So if there are any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A now. Very happy to answer any questions or clarifications as we've gone through this process. And while we're waiting to see if there's any questions that have popped up in there, we've actually got another question for you, which is, given where we are in the process at the moment and from what we've heard in the webinar, would you be interested in learning more about the process? And we've got very simple question. There's 4 key answers, which is yes, I'd like to know more, maybe, no, or not applicable. So the poll is going to launch now, and we just want to understand, has this whetted your appetite? Is this enough level of detail that you're interested in, or do you already know what you need to know about it? So the poll's just sort of popped up in front, and very curious to hear what you think of it. And in the meantime, we've got a question in the chat that's popped up, which is, if the JCA is non-binding, how much weight is expected to be given in the local HTA assessment process? I mean, that's a really, really interesting question. It is expected to be used and utilised in the process, but so all countries must use some parts of it. But to the extent of what they use about it, is unclear at the moment. As I mentioned, the EU will be requiring countries to report back on which parts they've used, how they've used them in their country assessment, and what they've done with the data. But as the country processes are still uncertain, and that's what countries are going to be focused on the next 2 years, which is translating the outputs from this into what that means for their processes, it's a bit uncertain how and what they are going to end up with at this stage. So I hope that answers your question. And in terms of the poll, it sounds like there's certainly a majority of people here that are interested in learning more about the process, which is really interesting to hear and see. And it's certainly something that we find fascinating. We'll be doing more and talking more around next year, particularly as more insight becomes available.
We had another question coming up in the chat on any insights on how the EU HTA framework will be viewed by the UK. Interesting, very interesting question. That, I mean, NICE, I think, is quite clear that it's going to continue its NICE scientific process and its HTA process, and because of Brexit we have left Europe, so there is going to be no collaboration between the EU HTA and NICE. But one interesting thing that NICE has done is it has started having collaborations with other Commonwealth countries such as Canada and Australia, and it's looking to build a network to share on HTA advice with that. I actually spoke to Mindhurt at NICE when we were at ISPOR, and one of the questions was, is this going to be in competition to EU HTA, which he found very amusing, and he sort of said, no, the processes are going to be very different. We just want to be able to offer as much support as possible to ensure manufacturers can, deliver the best quality materials. So I think the two systems are going to run separately rather than being any closer alignment, unfortunately.
But there is another interesting implication, which is what are other countries in other jurisdictions going to do with the clinical assessment, because it will be available in English and potentially 27 different languages as well, and this will be very early on. So in some of the, let's say, Asian markets or African or LATAM markets, it could be used by those countries to as part of their processes. The wider global implications of this will be interesting to follow how they play out.
We have another question as well, which is based on what principles would the assessors decide PICOs out of the 27 that they receive?
Yes, and there's a very interesting and quite complex document that's actually being published by EU UNETA at the moment on this, and effectively they're going to work through it systematically based on the number of responses that they've got to try and come up with the minimum number of PICOs that actually come out. It's well worth a read if you're interested in the detail behind it, and it's going to be a interesting process for working through. And while in some of the diseases to start with that they're looking at, it may be relatively straightforward, it's going to be much more challenging for some of the later indications that come through, where there's more diversity in terms of how they are going to get down to this 1, 2, 3 number of PICOs at the end, of which you have to put the evidence forward against versus having a multitude. And I think that's really going to be one of those questions where the theory seems good in practice, but how will that translate in reality? Any other final questions? Well, while we're just waiting for that, we have one final question for you today, which is basically, what do you think of the webinar? How well did this webinar meet your expectations? And it's a very simple 3-point question. 1, below expectations. 2, met expectations. Or 3, exceeded expectations. The poll is going to launch now. So if you could provide your feedback, that would be hugely appreciated. And as well as any comments or thoughts around what you'd like to see, either in another webinar or any other information. And while that poll is running, there's another question, which is, would the manufacturer be obliged to provide information on all the selected PICOs in the JCA dossier? Yes, is the short answer, that the manufacturer should provide evidence against each of these 3 PICOs. And this is going to be one of the key 1, 2, 3 PICOs, however many PICOs there's going to be, because that is the expectation that your product will be judged against. Now, there are also some methodological challenges which are still ongoing at the moment in terms of how, for example, the use of indirect treatment comparisons, etc., can actually be used for exactly this issue, but they're still being resolved at the moment. But yes, the expectation is that your product will have to be compared to these 3 PICOs that come up, and you'll have a relatively short space of time in which to do this. So it's going to be quite time intensive to put this all together. Okay, so in terms of the poll, thank you very much. It seems that at least it sort of met or exceeded your expectations, which is fantastic to hear. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much. We've now arrived at the end of the session. It's been a real pleasure to discuss this really fascinating topic with you. Personally, I think this is one of the biggest changes in the pricing market access landscape in the last 10, 15 years, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to Graham or myself, or our contact details are on this slide here. We're very happy to discuss the implications in more detail with you if you wanted, or any other topics similar to this. So I wish you all a great morning or afternoon, depending on whereabouts you are based, and thank you very much for your time.
Yep, thank you very much, and we will be putting a recording of this webinar on our web page within the next week. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you very much.